we can go right ahead and talk about Malachi Flynn's random 50-point game. Now, I say random because he's coming off the bench, and throughout his career, he's averaged only 4 points per game. So this is probably the most random 50-point game in NBA history, and the most recent random 50-point game that I can remember is when Eric Gordon when James Harden was out for Houston, just randomly decided to drop 50 on the Jazz. And that sort of, to me at least, that felt like the start of a bunch of random players just having these ridiculous games, because Eric Gordon, he was coming off the bench, but in that game he was starting, and he's really, he's a very good basketball player, and he was known to be a phenomenal basketball player before his time with Houston. But around the time, when he was on Houston, he was primarily, he was considered to be a role player, compared to the rest of the team that was, where the offense was heavily reliant on James Harden and Chris Paul. He was seen as a role player in that system. And ever since he just randomly had this 50-point game, I've seen more role players just have more random 40-point, 50 points, and 30-point games than I would have normally. And it's sort of it's begged the question, has defense gotten better, or has defense gotten worse, or has offense gotten better, or is it just a combination of both? Because with this 50-point game, Malachi Flynn now has a better career high than players like Paul George, Manu Ginobili, Kevin Garnett, Magic Johnson, Kawhi Leonard, Chris Paul, and even Bill Russell. So the fact that I don't want to say random, but the fact that a bench player, yeah, that's the better word. The fact that a bench player was able to come out and score 50 in a game is literally unheard of. It's never happened in the history of basketball. And when people see that, the first thing that they could think of is, the defense is so lazy in this league. It's obviously, anyone can score 50 if they just have a good night. And that's sort of been the casual take when you look at all of these random 50-point games that some of these players have. Just last night, I'll list off all the dominant performances from last night. So you have Malachi Flynn's 50-point game. Devin Booker ended the game with 40 points and 8 assists. CJ McCollum ended the game with 36 points. Anthony Davis ended the game with 35 points and 18 rebounds. Jaren Jackson Jr. ended the game with 35 points and 3 steals. Kevin Durant ended the game with 32 points, 6 rebounds, and 7 assists. Paolo Banchero ended the game with 32 points. Jordan Poole ended the game with 29 points. Jalen Johnson ended the game with 28, 14, and 11 with 4 steals and 1 block for the Atlanta Hawks. So phenomenal game for him. Anthony Edwards ended the game with 28 points. Cam Thomas ended the game with 27. Kristaps Porzingis ended the game with 27 and 12. Pascal Siakam ended the game with 26. LeBron ended the game with 25, 7, and 9. Tatum ended with 24. Halliburton ended with 24. DeAndre Ayton ended with 24 and 16. Jaylen Brown ended with 23. Scoot ended with 22 and 10. Giannis ended with 21, 7, and 8, along with 5 blocks. And those were all the outstanding performances that I had written down. And when you look at that, in hindsight, it's normal to think the defense has sort of been relatively lackluster. And when you look at these games, when you're just turning on the TV, it looks as if the players, they aren't really trying as much on defense as they are on offense, because most of the time we see the corner three as a wide open shot. That's the shot that a lot of teams try to look for now in this league. If it's not a shot in the paint, then it's going to be a corner three. And we usually see defenses rather lazy to go and make that rotation and try to contest that jumper. And not to mention the rest of how the NBA refs, I didn't mean to say refs, but how the refs sort of officiate the game. It's also impacted how we think the game how we think the game actually is. So, like, for example, the refs, they now in the NBA, they give technical fouls for, it feels like, for anything. But back in the day, a technical foul back then required a lot more force than it would require now. So, like, a technical foul now, or even a flagrant foul now, it would require, like, there's less of a requirement for a technical or a flagrant foul to be called. But back in the day, it would seem like, oh, that's just a common foul. Like, the most common example is what the bad boy Pistons did to Michael Jordan, where it's like the stipulation around it is like, oh my God, every single time Michael Jordan went up, we knocked him to the ground. Like, you would think that they were just throwing haymakers at him, or they were just elbowing him every single time he would drive to the paint. And they would do that, but not every single time. Like, hand check, as much as they refused to admit it, hand checking was a thing back in the NBA, back when Michael Jordan was playing. There were several clips I can pull up where Michael Jordan gets, where there's a foul called on Jordan for hand checking, or there's a foul called on the defender for hand checking Michael Jordan. And the ref literally does this, and this is a symbol for hand checking in the referee handbook. So, with all of that in mind, like, with how, like, the thought process is that back then it was tougher and now it's, like, a little bit softer, that also, like, applies for the defenses and, like, the effort being put on defense. And I don't really understand that, because how is it, like, the players, they might have gotten soft, but, like, they might have gotten less aggressive. That's the proper word. It's not soft. They might have been less aggressive, but that's just because they're trying not to send the players to the free throw line. Because back then, if you send someone to the line, and chances are the only people that you'd send to the line are big men because they would dominate the paint, they wouldn't be able to shoot. So it really wouldn't matter, like, what you did with them. If they can't shoot, they can't convert those 2 points. Now with teams, like, figuring out that, like, oh, we need to hit free throws, the rest of the defense isn't going to just allow you to take free throws, especially with players that live at the line, like Joel Embiid, James Harden. They aren't going to try to foul any of them. Like, imagine back then, like, if a player was able to manipulate the rules like how Harden was able to do it. Back then, I guarantee you a lot of players would come up with that defensive strategy of just trying not to foul him. Like, I feel like it's normal. And the fact that now zone defense is a thing in the NBA, I honestly think it's made it a little bit more difficult to score, because if you do not have a team that has shooters, then teams can go up and press you in a 2-3 zone and ultimately exploit your lack of spacing. Because in a 2-3, it's primarily meant to guard, like, in the painted area. And the reason why it wasn't a thing back then is because, like, so many teams would have abused that 2-3 defense to stop all of the big men that go in the paint, and they forced everyone to play man. And forcing everyone to play man, while it might sound like the defenses are much tougher, it's really not. Because it's a lot easier to go by one defender than it is to go by 2 or 3, which is what a lot of players, and a lot of good players, I should say, are usually accustomed to seeing. Like, again, James Harden. Now, if 90s rules would be applied to James Harden, teams wouldn't be able to send a double team over to him unless, like, they fully commit. Like, they can't hedge a double team and force him to pass. They have to fully commit to that double. And with that in mind, and with how the spacing was back then, you were able to, like, afford to double team a specific player, because chances are most of the other players would try to get a little bit closer to the painted area, and since they're much more closer and the floor was a lot smaller, it becomes a lot easier for players to just go back out there and contest. Now with how the spacing is, because the spacing is a reaction to zone defense. Like, that's what spacing is. So the offense needed to adapt to the new defensive rule change. Like, that's how I see it. Because if NBA players played man now, Luka Doncic and company would probably end up scoring way more points and end up producing a lot more, like, individually, as opposed to now where they have to, like, make the right reads and make the right play. Because as the best player now, that's sort of what you're expected to do. And back then, you didn't really have to do that. Like, the second you got by your defender, and the only reason why there was, like, legitimate help defense back then in the paint was not as sweet as as a lot of the older players would like to say. It's because there was no spacing. You remove that spacing, and chances are, and Michael Jordan would probably average 50 in that league, just because, like, all you'd have to do is just clear out everyone, make sure there's nobody in the paint, and once that happens, like, since defenders cannot play help defense, he's just gonna blow by every single defender every single time. And like, with how the skill gap was back then, no one was better than Michael back then, and no one was able to guard him one-on-one. Like, that's just known. Like, the defense back then, while there were some players that were, like, individually better at playing defense, it wasn't a majority of the NBA. And now zone defense has sort of allowed, and, like, help defense and rotations and things of that nature has sort of helped defenses actually get better, because now teams are able to, like, switch off of screens. And sometimes that would be beneficial, other times it really wouldn't, but forcing a player to fight through the screen, chances are that just creates an open shot more times than it would if the player were to just switch. And that switch would in turn cause the guard to needing to get past the center, this, that, and the other. And it could really go both ways. It's either the guard tries to isolate the center or the center tries to isolate the guard. It's one of two things. And you wouldn't be able to do that back in the NBA with how the defense was structured back then. So I actually think that it's both. Like, the defense didn't get worse. It got better, but the offense just got dramatically better as it responded to all of the defensive changes. And, like, there needed to be a shift in, like, the offensive game. And Curry, obviously, like, being the catalyst of all that thing. I think it's just a mixture of both. Like, both the defense got better and the offense just got better. It's just which one got more better is the real question, and that's offense. Offense ultimately became much better because now a lot of players are expected to do more for the team than to just fill in a role. So, like, Michael Jordan, like, he was obviously, like, their dominant scorer, but you wouldn't really ask him to do much other than score. Whereas, like, with now in the NBA, if you're the best player on the team, you're asked to be able to score, you're asked to be able to defend, and you're also asked to be able to create good shots for your team because you can get yourself open. And that's why zone defense, and that's why the help happens, because all of these players, they're just so good on offense now that you have to come over and help because they demand a double team, which in turn creates open looks for the others. And with the spacing being how it is, it's either you live with the best player taking the shot, or you live with someone else taking the shot. And most of the time, teams would rather someone else take the shot because it is a corner three. It is a much deeper shot than if they were to just blow by somebody in the paint, and it's less of a guarantee that they will even score those 3 points. So I think the defenses, they've gotten smarter. They haven't gotten worse. Now, lazier, that's a different topic. The defense might have most definitely has gotten a little bit lazier, but that's mainly because now, like, teams are sort of expected to make those rotations every single time up and down the court. That is a lot of running to tax on your players, not to mention also expect them to perform well offensively. Like, we'll just give LeBron James, for example. We see LeBron James, he's, like, very, very, like, when it's not the fourth quarter, his hustle on defense is very weak. And a lot of people say, like, oh, it's because he's lazy and he doesn't want to play defense. But in reality, it's because he has to focus on the offense because he is the team's, like, he's 9 times out of 10, he's the team's offense, and he's the reason why the team finds success. So there's more value to him on the offensive side of the ball than there is on the defensive side of the ball, meaning he needs to have his stamina ready so that way he can conduct the offense, especially, like, the fact that he's older now also doesn't help things. So that's sort of the reason why you don't see a lot of, like, star players try to rotate out there on defense, because that's a lot of running, and players will lose their breath because they're expected to run all around the court on defense with how all the rotations are and with the spacing, and then at the same time you expect them to come down the court and create a shot for themselves in isolation. Like, that just doesn't work. And it's like, that's way too much pressure on your lungs. And I understand that these are pro players and, like, they should expect that. But, like, as a human being, that takes a toll on you. And it's like, you can only run for so much. You can only run for so long and not get tired. Obviously, like, you know, some players are built different. Some players, they just don't get tired and they will just continue to run around the court like a maniac, like Steph Curry. But other players aren't like that. Like, they don't have the lung capacity. People are different. And that's something that a lot of people that watch the NBA, they sort of forget that it's like, these guys are human too. These guys need to take a breather sometimes too. And they would rather get the possession over with than needing to play defense so that way they can go ahead and use their stamina on offense. And it's like, most of the time when you have a good offense, it projects on the well, I think it's more the other way around, actually. Scratch that. The better defense you have, the better your offense will be because you have more energy after getting a stop. But that's sort of like my opinions on, like, the defense and the offense in this league and which ones got, like, what got better. I think it's just a mix of both. So with that, we are out of time for this first segment. So now I will be going into the second segment where I talk about two things because, and I call it Basketball Buzz. So it's basically just where I talk about, like, the big news that's going on around basketball. Like, usually, like, if I can't fit it into one whole segment, I'll make it into 2 different types of topics and make it into one whole segment. So that's what I'm going to do right here, where I'm going to talk about Bronny entering the transfer portal as well as Julius Randle needing to undergo surgery. So I will be right back after this short break.